The digital clock on the nightstand flickered 2:47 a.m., the neon red numbers bleeding into the darkness like a warning light. In the hallway, the silence was thicker than the shadows, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical hum of a white noise machine seeping from behind the master bedroom door. It was a soothing sound, simulated rain, designed to drown out the world. I gripped the wainscoting so hard my fingernails left indentations in the paint. Then came the pop. It wasn't loud, but it was definitive. A warm, terrifying rush hit the floor, and I watched, detached, as my water pooled on the dark espresso hardwood. The floors I had picked out, paid for, and spent 3 weekends staining while he was at the office. "Mark," I wheezed, the word catching on a jagged spike of pain that rolled through my abdomen. "Mark, it's time." I waited for the bed to creak. I waited for the panicked thud of feet hitting the floor. Instead, I heard the muffled shift of a pillow and his voice, flat and distant through the wood. "I can't, Elena. I have the quarterly presentation at 9. I need my sleep. Call an Uber or something. I'll meet you there after the Q&A. Then the sound that shattered the last 7 years, the metallic click of the door lock engaging. He wasn't just staying in bed, he was locking me out of our shared life to ensure his rest remained undisturbed. I didn't scream. I didn't pound on the door until my knuckles bled. I simply leaned against the wall, breathing through the white-hot contraction, and looked at the closed door. In that surreal, agonizing clarity, I didn't see my husband. I saw a squatter. I saw a liability. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and bypassed his contact name. I called my mother. "Come get me," I whispered when she picked up, "and bring the folder from my desk. The one labeled Project Exit. That closed door cost Mark the house, the savings, his reputation, and every meticulously crafted lie he'd spent 7 years building. He thought he was choosing a good night's sleep. He didn't know he had just signed his eviction notice from my life. Before we go any further, I need to say this. While some names and dates have been shifted to protect the innocent and the guilty, this story is built on the bones of a reality too many of us know by heart. Since I first went public with what happened that night, my inbox has become a graveyard of similar betrayals. I'm sharing this not just for the catharsis, but as a map for the woman currently standing in a dark hallway wondering if she's crazy. You aren't. I want to see the scale of our collective strength. If you've ever been told you're overreacting while your world was actively falling apart, I want you to drop your city or country in the comments. I want to know exactly where the women are who are tired of being gaslit in their own homes. Stay with me, because the lock on that door, it was the best thing he ever did for me. 7 years ago, David didn't look like a man who would lock a door on a laboring woman. He looked like the answer to a question I'd stopped asking. We met at a mutual friends gallery opening in Chelsea. At 31, I was a senior estate planning paralegal, a job that required me to be a professional skeptic. I spent my days hunting for missing heirs and spotting the tiny, jagged discrepancies in trust fund disbursements. I lived in a world of fine print and what-ifs. David, however, felt like the headline I'd been waiting for. He was attentive in a way that felt like sunlight. Warm, pervasive, and seemingly honest. While other men talked about their marathons or their portfolios, David spent our first date asking about my childhood. He sat leaning forward, his chin in his hand, his eyes never leaving mine. It was intoxicating. The real litmus test, however, was my mother, Margaret. My father passed when I was 20, leaving a void that Margaret filled with sharp wit and an even sharper mind. A recently retired forensic accountant, she was a woman who could smell hidden accounts like other people smell rain. She was my best friend, my advisor, and the only person I trusted more than myself. I'll never forget the Sunday brunch where she met him. She was wearing my father's vintage 1964 Omega Seamaster, the leather strap worn soft against her wrist. It was her talisman. She wore it every single day. David didn't just notice it. He knelt down slightly to get a better look at the dial. "That's a beautiful piece of history," he said softly. The patina on that face. A man who's remembered that precisely must have been worth knowing. Margaret's eyes softened, a rare occurrence with the stranger. Later that night, as we did the dishes, she turned to me with a thoughtful look. "He listens like he's taking notes, Elena. It's a rare quality in a man these days." At the time, I beamed. I thought it was the ultimate compliment. I thought it meant he was memorizing my favorite coffee order, the way I liked my pillows, fluffed, and the stories of my father's kindness. I didn't realize that taking notes was exactly what he was doing. He wasn't learning by heart, he was scouting the terrain. He was learning how to mimic the perfect man so he could gain access to the life I'd built for myself. My mother and I were a fortress of logic and shared history, but David didn't try to knock the walls down. He simply studied the blueprints until we let him in through the front gate. He played the part of the devoted son-in-law, helping Margaret with her taxes and bringing her favorite lilies every Tuesday. He understood early on that to have me, he had to win her. And he did it by weaponizing the very thing we valued most, attention to detail. We thought his precision was a sign of devotion. We didn't realize it was the mark of a predator who knows that the best way to hide a lie is to wrap it in a dozen truths. For 7 years, I lived in that sunlight. I bought the house, I built the savings, and I let him into every corner of my financial and emotional world. I thought I was building a legacy with a partner who saw me. In reality, I was just handing the keys to a man who was waiting for the right moment to turn the lock. The thing about a slowly filling room is that you don't notice the water until it's at your chin. Looking back, the cracks didn't announce themselves. They arrived quietly, wrapped in reasonable explanations and soft voices. Each one was small enough to rationalize, logical enough to dismiss. But they were consistent. And consistency, I would later understand, is the signature of intention. The first thing David took was the checkbook. It happened gradually, the way all significant transfers of power do. 6 months into our marriage, he suggested that since I worked so hard and carried so much stress, the least he could do was handle the household finances. He framed it as chivalry, as partnership. I handed it over with genuine gratitude. I was busy. I was building my career. I trusted him. But the moment I asked a question, a single benign question about our savings account balance in our 2nd year of marriage, something shifted in his expression. It was brief, barely a flicker. His jaw tightened before his smile returned. "Why are you worried about that? Don't you trust me?" he said. The words were gentle. The architecture behind them was not. Then he started on my mother. "Margaret's a little intense, don't you think?" was the first salvo, delivered casually after a Sunday dinner. I laughed it off. Forensic accountants tend to be direct. I told him that was just her way. But the comments kept coming, soft and relentless. "She looks at me like I'm a case file. Then, I feel like I'm on trial when we visit." Then during my 3rd trimester, a new suggestion, delivered as concern for my stress levels, that perhaps we could skip Thanksgiving at Margaret's. Travel is hard this late in pregnancy. She can visit after the baby. He was building a wall, one polite brick at a time, between me and the only person who had the skill set to see through him. Meanwhile, our joint account had a peculiar condition. It was perpetually, almost artfully, insufficient. When my college friends planned a reunion weekend in Savannah, I checked the balance and found it exactly $200 short of workable. I mentioned it to David, who shook his head sympathetically. "Timing is terrible this month, Elle. Maybe next year." 2 weeks later, he came home talking enthusiastically about the new golf club membership he'd signed up for. A networking necessity, he explained, for his consulting business. I didn't connect those 2 moments. I should have. The pregnancy was the final accelerant. As my body changed and my emotions grew rawer, David developed a clinical vocabulary for my reasonable concerns. When I asked why a freelance payment he'd mentioned hadn't appeared in our account, I was spiraling. When I noticed a discrepancy in our mortgage escrow statement, I was nesting and fixating. When I cried because he cancelled our birthing class for the second time, I was hormonal. He delivered these diagnoses with such calm authority that I began to second-guess my own cognition. That is a specific kind of violence. The weaponization of a woman's emotional state against her own clarity. But my mother noticed the stack. She came to stay during my 8th month, filling my kitchen with the smell of her pot roast and the sound of her decisive footsteps. David was on his best behavior that week, attentive, warm, the man I'd met at the gallery. But Margaret had spent 30 years decoding fraudulent ledgers, and she understood that the most dangerous falsified documents are the ones that look pristine. On her last evening, we sat on the porch while David took a work call that seemed to require him to pace the far end of the yard. She reached over and took my hand. She didn't look at me. She just watched the yard. "You'd tell me if something was wrong, wouldn't you?" she asked. The question was quiet, but it landed with the weight of everything she hadn't said all week. I looked at my husband pacing the grass, and I heard myself say, "Everything is fine, Mum." It was the worst lie I ever told. It cost me another 4 months of silence, but it was the last one. The recovery from a C-section is a slow, burning haze, but the recovery from abandonment is a cold, sharp blade. 3 days after the birth of my daughter, Sophie, I was back in the house. The house I'd bought, yet suddenly felt like a guest in. My mother was a silent force of nature, moving through the rooms with a focused intensity. David had finally appeared at the hospital at noon on the day I delivered, smelling of expensive espresso and sounding deeply aggrieved by the construction on the I-95. He hadn't asked how many hours I'd been in labor. He hadn't asked about the door he'd locked. He'd simply kissed my forehead, called Sophie the little tax deduction, and checked his watch. Now he was working late again, catching up on the productivity he'd supposedly lost while I was in surgery. "Elena, I'm going to borrow the laptop to print that lemon chicken recipe," my mother said, her voice even. I was nursing Sophie on the sofa, my body aching with every movement. "Go ahead, Mom, it's on the kitchen island." I heard the familiar chime of the MacBook waking up. Then silence. Usually, Margaret narrates her technical frustrations. "Where is the icon? Why is this mouse so sensitive?" But this time, there was nothing. No clicking, no printing, just a stillness that felt heavier than the house itself. David had stayed logged in. He was arrogant like that, the arrogance of a man who thinks his wife is too tired, too hormonal, and too broken to ever look. Margaret didn't call me over. She didn't gasp. For 20 minutes, she simply stood there. I later learned she was methodically using her phone to take high-resolution photos of every screen. She saw the wire transfers, thousands of dollars moving from our empty joint account into an offshore entity titled DR Holdings. She saw the emails with a real estate agent in a city 3 states away, discussing the separation timeline and liquidation of marital assets. And then she saw Carla. The emails to Carla weren't just cruel, they were a roadmap. "She's in the hospital now," one read. "The drama is almost over. Once the house sells and I have the payout, I'm done. Just hold on a few more weeks, babe." Margaret didn't print the recipe. She closed the laptop with a soft, final thud. She walked into the living room, her face a mask of iron. She didn't cry. She didn't even look angry. She looked like a woman who had just found the missing decimal point that changed everything. "The roast needs another hour," she said, her voice dropping into that low, professional register she used when she was auditing a crooked firm. "Let's sit, Elena. Put the baby in the bassinet." "Mom, what's wrong?" "Everything," she said, sitting beside me and pulling out her phone. "But only for tonight. Tomorrow we start the audit." She swiped through the photos. I saw my life, my marriage, my savings, my sense of reality, dismantled in 4,000-pixel clarity. The man upstairs, who had locked his door while I bled on the floor, wasn't just a coward. He was a thief who had been planning his exit since before the pregnancy test turned blue. He thinks you're weak right now, Margaret whispered, her eyes flashing with a terrifying predatory light. He thinks you're a tired new mother who won't fight back. He's forgotten who raised you. She leaned in, her thumb scrolling past a photo of a wire transfer that should have been my daughter's college fund. Tonight, we let him sleep, she said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. Tomorrow, we take it all back. The vertigo was physical. I felt as though the floor, those espresso boards I'd paid for, had suddenly turned into liquid. The documents my mother scrolled through weren't just financial records. They were a blueprint for my erasure. David hadn't just been stealing money. He had been building a dossier. There were notes in his drafts folder detailing my concerning lapses in memory and increasingly volatile emotional state. He was gaslighting me in real time to a future judge, painting a picture of a woman so unraveled by postpartum depression that she couldn't be trusted with her own child, let alone her own assets. He didn't just want out. He wanted the house, the savings, and primary custody, likely to ensure I'd be paying him child support from the career he knew I'd fought to build. A hot, jagged rage surged in my chest. I looked toward the stairs, my hands shaking. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drag him out of that bed by his hair and throw every lie in his face. I wanted to show him that I wasn't the shattered woman he'd described to Carla. Margaret's hand clamped onto my wrist like a vice. "No," she said. Her voice was a low, terrifying snap. "Do not go up there. Mum, he's planning to take Sophie. He's stealing everything." "I know," she said, her eyes locked on mine. "And if you go up there now, you'll give him exactly what he needs. You'll scream, you'll cry, and he'll record it. He'll call it another episode. You confront a thief, Elena, and they destroy the evidence. You document a thief, and you destroy them." I took a shuddering breath, looking at my daughter sleeping in the bassinet. She was so small, so oblivious to the predator in the next room. The realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave. I was no longer just a wife or a daughter. I was a mother, and a mother's first duty is to be the wolf at the door. "What do we do?" I whispered. "We play the part," Margaret said, her mind already moving 3 steps ahead. "He wants an overwhelmed, fragile new mother. You give him an Oscar-winning performance. You let him think his plan is working. Give him no reason to change his passwords or hide his trail any deeper." The pivot was instantaneous. The fog of the C-section and the exhaustion of the last few days didn't vanish, but they became a suit of armor. I would be the hormonal wife he expected. I would let him comfort me while Margaret, working from my home office under the guise of helping with the baby, meticulously reconstructed every cent he'd moved and every lie he'd told. "I'm not doing this for revenge, Mom," I said, watching the staircase. "I know you're not," she replied. "I'm doing it because I won't let my daughter grow up watching her mother be erased. He thinks he's been taking notes on me. He has no idea who's been taking notes on him." That night, for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was drowning. I felt like I was underwater, yes, but I was the shark. And the man upstairs was just bait. 6 weeks is a long time to lie to someone who is already lying to you. The performance began the morning after my mother showed me the emails. David came downstairs in his weekend clothes, already scrolling his phone, the kind of man who checks his messages before saying good morning. I was in the kitchen, in my nursing bra and a cardigan, Sophie in my arms, looking every inch the depleted woman he'd written about in his drafts folder. "Good morning," I said, my voice soft and foggy. "I made the coffee strong. You've been so tired lately." He looked up. A flicker of relief crossed his face, followed by satisfaction. Barely perceptible, but I was watching for it. He kissed my temple and reached for the mug. "Thanks, babe. You look exhausted. Try to nap when she does." "I know." I sighed, touching his arm. "I don't know what I'd do without you handling everything." I felt him relax into my dependence like it was a hot bath. Over the following 6 weeks, I gave him what he'd written me into being: grateful, foggy, slightly undone. I stopped asking about money, stopped reviewing the mail that I had quietly rerouted to a P.O. box 3 weeks prior. That was the paralegal in me, force of habit, and started performing a flawless display of managed chaos. I was the overwhelmed new mother, forever misplacing her keys, forever grateful for his calm authority. "I think Mom might be stressing me out," I told him one Thursday, looking up from a feeding with authentic-seeming vulnerability. "She's a lot. Maybe she visits less for a while." David's pause before responding was 1 millisecond too long. He was recalibrating, rechecking the trap he'd set to see if it had sprung. "Only if you think it's best, Elle," he said carefully. "I just want you to feel supported." Margaret, bless her forensic heart, played her part flawlessly. She appeared less, she called instead. What David didn't know was that those calls averaged 45 minutes and covered every financial document she'd reconstructed from his digital footprint. She called it building the ledger, using the same language she'd used in her professional life when she was about to testify against a fraudulent firm. By week 3, David had stopped password protecting his laptop. By week 4, he left a bank statement for DR Holdings on his desk, a mistake a careful man would never make, but a confident man makes all the time. I photographed it without touching it. I photographed everything without touching it. Margaret's file grew thick with evidence. The offshore account that had received $157,000 in transfers over 3 years, the real estate agent's contract for a condo purchased in David's name alone the previous April, the falsified behavior log he'd sent to a family attorney, a woman named Patricia Hendricks, whose business card I found in his jacket while doing the laundry. The log described my paranoid accusations, my inability to manage household responsibilities, and my volatile reactions to normal conversations. He had been writing fiction about my life and calling it a legal record. He had also been telling Carla the bedroom details. I found that in a message thread where she had asked, "Does she still think you love her?" And his response was a laughing emoji, followed by, "She's too tired to think anything." I read that at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, made his coffee, handed it to him with a smile, and said, "You're going to do great in your meeting today." That was the hardest morning of my life. I kissed him goodnight each evening, knowing he had drafted a custody evaluation that called me an unfit mother. I handed him his dry-cleaned shirts, knowing he'd used our daughter's education fund to pay for another woman's weekend in Montauk. I laughed at his dinner table stories, knowing that 3 states away, a condo was sitting empty, waiting to receive everything he'd stolen from me. But his confidence was growing, and confidence, as any forensic accountant's daughter knows, is when the truly careless mistakes happen. He had no idea the evidence file was now 47 pages long. He had no idea the woman he'd called too tired to think had already made her first call to an attorney. He chose a Wednesday morning for what he believed would be my ambush. The mediation office was in a glass-fronted building downtown. Neutral ground, he'd told me, just to get organized financially since things have been so chaotic. He'd said it with such practiced gentleness, touching my shoulder, his voice carrying the particular softness he reserved for moments when he needed me to comply. He'd even offered to drive me. I told him I'd meet him there. I had an errand to run. The errand was collecting my attorney, Diana Reyes, from her office 2 blocks away. David was already seated when I arrived, positioned across from the mediator, a measured, silver-haired woman named Carol, with his own attorney beside him. He'd arranged himself carefully, shirt sleeves rolled to suggest accessibility, a yellow legal pad in front of him to suggest organization, a look of tender concern already occupying his face. He'd rehearsed this. When I walked in with Diana on one side and my mother on the other, I watched the concern flicker, just for a half-second. Then he recalibrated. "Elena?" he said warmly, standing. "I didn't know you were bringing—" A soft laugh. "Well, the more the merrier, right? Mom." He nodded at Margaret with practiced cordiality. My mother sat down, placed her hands on the table, and said nothing. David began his performance. He spoke to Carol in a low, measured voice about his genuine worry for my mental state since the birth. He used clinical-sounding language, dysregulation, dissociative episodes concerning behavioral patterns, that told me he'd been coached. He expressed sadness, he expressed hope that we could get Elena the support she needs before making any permanent decisions. His attorney slid a folder across the table. David's behavior log, formatted professionally, 3 years of fictional instability wearing my name. He was good. He was very, very good. Carol turned to look at me, her expression carefully neutral. Diana spoke before I did. "Thank you, David. We've actually reviewed that document." She reached into her briefcase and placed our counterfile on the table. It was not a thin folder. It was a 3-inch binder, tabbed and indexed, the way my mother had kept every professional audit of her 30-year career. "We'd like to walk through a few items of our own." What followed was the quietest devastation I have ever witnessed. Diana walked the room through the wire transfers. $157,000 across 11 transactions, all routed to DR Holdings, an LLC registered to a David Raymond, formed 14 months before he suggested combining finances to simplify things. She presented the real estate contract for a condo in Charlotte, purchased 9 months ago with funds transferred from what he'd told me was our daughter's college savings account. She presented the email chain with Patricia Hendricks, the family attorney he'd pre-hired, time-stamped 6 weeks before Sophie was born. Then she presented the Carla correspondence. David's attorney put a hand on his arm. David ignored it. His jaw had gone rigid. "Margaret has clearly been involved in building a case against me from the beginning," he said, his voice dropping its warmth. "She's never accepted our marriage. She's always undermined David." My mother's voice was quiet. It landed like a gavel. She hadn't spoken until that moment. Every eye in the room moved to her. "I didn't hate you," Margaret said, folding her hands on the table. "I hoped I was wrong about you, genuinely." She paused. But the numbers didn't add up from year 2. The joint account showed consumption patterns inconsistent with your reported income. The mortgage escrow discrepancy in year 3 suggested a secondary financial obligation. I didn't want to see it. I looked away longer than I should have. She slid a single page across the table, a clean professional summary sheet, the kind she used to prepare for federal testimony. "I just counted," she said simply. David looked at the page, then at me. The performance was gone. What was underneath it was something I had never seen on his face before. The particular cold panic of a man who has just understood that the woman he called too trusting to notice had been the one taking notes all along. Carol, the mediator, quietly turned her legal pad face down. She didn't need it anymore. The collapse of David's architecture was as swift as it was surgical. When he had insisted on a prenuptial agreement 6 years ago, he'd framed it as a mature way to protect our future independence. What he hadn't counted on was that my attorney Diana had included a standard but robust infidelity and financial bad faith clause. By documenting his 3-year siphoning of marital assets into an offshore LLC and proving the affair with Carla, we didn't just reclaim the money. We triggered a clawback that drained his own personal holdings. The house, my house, stayed mine. The court ordered him out within 48 hours. Custody was resolved with chilling speed. When his own attorney saw the evidence of the unfit mother log, the way he had systematically planned to manufacture a mental health crisis to steal a newborn from her mother, he advised David to settle immediately. That log, intended to be his weapon, became the proof of his psychological abuse. He was granted supervised visitation, a condition he has yet to actually use. Carla, it turned out, was less interested in a soulmate who was currently being sued for financial fraud and whose soon-to-be wealthy status had evaporated into legal fees and restitution. She was gone before the moving truck had even finished loading his boxes. The most telling moment came 3 weeks after the mediation. David, desperate, and perhaps still believing he could charm his way out of a ledger, called my mother. "Margaret, please," he began when she answered. "I just want to explain my side of—" "I already counted, David," she interrupted. Her voice was flat, devoid of anger or interest. There's nothing left to say." She hung up after 4 words. His professional reputation, built on the image of a stable, high-value consultant, didn't survive the discovery. In our social circles, the reaction was a quiet, embarrassed withdrawal. 2 of his former golfing buddies reached out to me, admitting they'd had a feeling. Something was off when he'd bragged about his Charlotte condo while I was 7 months pregnant. They hadn't said anything then. People rarely do until the storm has already passed. I am not triumphant. There is no joy in watching the person you love turn out to be a hollow construction of greed and mimicry. I am simply tired. But as I sit on my espresso hardwood floors, the ones I paid for, the ones I stained, the ones where I once stood alone in labor, I watch Sophie pull herself up to a crawl. The house is quiet now. The white noise machine is gone, and every door in this home stays unlocked. 3 years later, the espresso floors belong to a different family. Sophie and I live in a smaller, brighter house just 5 minutes from my mother. It's a house filled with sunlight and the chaotic, beautiful clutter of a toddler's life. On Sunday evenings, we still have dinner with Margaret. Sophie, now a whirlwind of curls and questions, often sits on her lap, sliding my father's vintage Omega watch up and down her tiny forearm like a golden cuff. She calls it her time teller. Watching them, I realize how close I came to losing this. Not just the house or the money, but the sanity required to be the mother she deserves. David didn't just want to leave me. He wanted to make me believe I deserved to be left. He wanted to rewrite my identity as a crazy woman so he could walk away as the hero of his own story. If you're watching this and someone is calling your clarity crazy, pay attention. They aren't worried about your mental health. They're worried about what you're about to find. The people who tell you that you're too suspicious are almost always the reason you had to learn to be. I used to think being taken care of was the ultimate goal. Now I know that the only thing better than being taken care of is being seen for exactly who you are. Trust the ones who show up at 2:47 a.m. and let go of the ones who think they can lock the door on your life and still keep a seat at your table. If you've ever had a moment where you finally counted the truth, tell me about it in the comments. Like this video if you've ever been underestimated, and subscribe. These stories have a way of finding the people who need them most.